Las Vegas, July 1973. The spotlight hit Elvis Presley as 2,500 fans erupted in applause at the Hilton International Hotel, but something was terribly wrong. His white jumpsuit, usually fitted perfectly, hung loosely on his frame in some places, while straining at the seams in others. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if every step required tremendous effort. Then, halfway through Can't Help Falling in Love, it happened. Elvis's knees buckled, his microphone hit the stage with a deafening thud, and the king of rock and roll collapsed in front of a horrified audience. The house lights came up, security rushed the stage, and the curtain dropped. But this wasn't the first time. What the audience didn't know was that this was the 7th collapse in just 3 months, and Elvis's doctor had been begging him to cancel the tour. The real medical crisis destroying Elvis wasn't just about pills or weight. It was something far more serious that his team had been desperately hiding from the public and the press. If you want to uncover the shocking medical truth behind Elvis's final years on stage and why he refused to stop performing even as his body was failing him, please subscribe to our channel. This investigation reveals documents and testimonies that have remained sealed for decades. The relationship between Elvis Presley and Las Vegas began as a triumph and ended as a trap. When Elvis returned to live performing in 1969, after years of making movies, his 4-week engagement at the newly opened International Hotel was supposed to be a comeback, a way to prove he was still relevant in an era dominated by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Those first shows were electric, powerful, career-defining performances that reminded the world why Elvis was called the King. He was lean, energetic, charismatic, and vocally strong. The reviews were rapturous, the ticket sales astronomical, and Colonel Tom Parker immediately locked Elvis into a contract that would bind him to Vegas for the next 8 years. What seemed like a lucrative deal in 1969 had become a prison by 1973. The contract Parker negotiated required Elvis to perform 2 shows a night, 7 days a week, for multiple weeks at a time, twice a year. There were no rest days built into the schedule, no accommodation for illness or fatigue, and severe financial penalties for cancelled shows. The Hilton had invested millions in building their showroom around Elvis's residency, and they expected him to deliver regardless of his condition. This relentless schedule would have been challenging for a healthy performer in their 20s. For Elvis, who was approaching 40 and already dealing with multiple health issues, it was a slow-motion death sentence. The financial pressure was immense, but it wasn't just about money. Colonel Parker had made deals that tied Elvis's income directly to his performing schedule. If Elvis didn't perform, the money stopped flowing, not just to Elvis, but to the dozens of people on his payroll, from his band members to his bodyguards to the entourage that lived at Graceland. Elvis felt responsible for all of them, trapped by his own generosity and Parker's manipulative contracts. But there was something else driving Elvis to continue performing even as his body began breaking down, something psychological that his doctors couldn't treat with pills or rest. The medical crisis didn't happen overnight. Looking back at footage from Elvis's Vegas performances between 1970 and 1972, subtle changes are visible to anyone who knows what to look for. His movements became slightly less fluid, his breathing more labored during high-energy numbers, his face showing signs of strain during sustained vocal passages. Band members later recalled that Elvis had started complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath as early as 1971, but he attributed these symptoms to stress and fatigue rather than recognizing them as warning signs of serious cardiac problems. Dr. George Nichopoulos, who would become known as Dr. Nick in the tabloids, first examined Elvis thoroughly in late 1971 and was alarmed by what he found. Elvis's blood pressure was dangerously elevated, his heart rate irregular, and initial tests suggested his heart was already showing signs of enlargement, a condition called cardiomegaly that indicated his heart muscle was being damaged by chronic hypertension and strain. Nick recommended immediate lifestyle changes, significant weight loss, a strict low-sodium diet, elimination of stimulant medications, reduced performance schedule, and regular cardiovascular monitoring. Elvis agreed to none of it. The reason for Elvis's refusal wasn't stubbornness or denial. It was fear. Elvis had watched his mother Gladys die of heart failure at age 46, and he was terrified of following the same path. But paradoxically, this fear didn't motivate him to take better care of himself. Instead, it created a fatalistic attitude where Elvis seemed to believe his fate was already sealed. So why bother changing? This psychological pattern would define his final years and make him nearly impossible to treat effectively. He would take pills to manage symptoms, but refuse to address underlying causes. He would promise to rest but continue performing. He would acknowledge he was sick, but insist he was fine. By early 1973, Elvis's stage collapses had become frequent enough that his team developed protocols to handle them. The pattern was usually the same. Elvis would seem fine during the first few songs, then gradually show signs of distress, excessive sweating beyond what the hot stage lights would cause, slurred speech between songs, missed lyrics in songs he had performed thousands of times, and a particular way of gripping the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. When these signs appeared, the band knew they had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before Elvis would likely go down. The first major public collapse occurred on February 18, 1973, during the dinner show. Elvis made it through about 40 minutes of his 90-minute set before his speech became noticeably slurred, and he began stumbling between marks on the stage. His backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations, moved closer to him, ready to physically support him if needed. Then, during American Trilogy, Elvis simply stopped singing mid-phrase, swayed visibly, and collapsed backward. His bodyguards, who had been positioned strategically in the wings for exactly this scenario, rushed on stage and carried him off, while the orchestra continued playing to cover the chaos. The official explanation given to the audience was food poisoning. The show was cancelled, ticket refunds were issued, and the incident was reported in local papers as a minor health scare. But backstage, the situation was far more serious. Elvis had lost consciousness completely. His pulse was racing at over 180 beats per minute, and his blood pressure had spiked to stroke-level readings. Nick, who had been standing by as he did for every performance, immediately administered medications to stabilize Elvis's heart rhythm and lower his blood pressure. It took nearly 30 minutes before Elvis regained full consciousness, and when he did, his first words were asking when the next show was scheduled. This incident should have been a wake-up call, a moment when everyone around Elvis recognized the severity of his condition and insisted he take time off to recover. Instead, it became the template for managing the crisis. Shows would be rescheduled rather than cancelled, medications would be adjusted to keep Elvis functional rather than healthy, and the team would simply get better at hiding the problem. The next show was 48 hours later, and Elvis was back on stage, still weak and unstable, because the financial machine couldn't afford to stop running. What Elvis's team managed to keep hidden from the public And the press was the true nature of his cardiac condition. Elvis wasn't just experiencing occasional fainting spells brought on by exhaustion or pills. He was suffering from a progressive cardiovascular disease that was getting worse with every performance. By mid-1973, Dr. Nick had brought in cardiac specialists who confirmed what he had feared. Elvis had developed both an enlarged heart and an arrhythmia condition that caused dangerous, irregular heartbeats. These conditions were being aggravated by several factors: his weight fluctuations, his prescription medication regimen, the physical demands of performing, and the environmental stress of the Vegas showroom. The stage environment itself was a significant health hazard for someone in Elvis's condition. The jumpsuits he wore, while visually spectacular with their jewels and embroidery, were incredibly heavy. Some weighed over 30 pounds. Combined with the intense heat from the stage lights, which raised the temperature on stage to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the physical exertion of 90-minute performances, Elvis was essentially subjecting his compromised cardiovascular system to extreme stress twice a night. It would be like asking someone with a heart condition to run a marathon in a sauna while wearing a weighted vest. The prescription medications Elvis was taking complicated everything further. While later narratives would focus on Elvis's drug abuse, the reality was more nuanced and more tragic. Most of the medications Elvis took were legitimately prescribed by doctors attempting to manage his various conditions: sleeping pills for chronic insomnia, pain medications for his back and joint problems, stimulants to help him function on his exhausting schedule, and sedatives to bring him down from the stimulants. Dr. Nick was trying to walk an impossible tightrope, managing Elvis's symptoms well enough that he could perform while trying to prevent the medication interactions that could trigger cardiac arrest. But here's what made the situation truly dangerous. Many of the medications Elvis was taking had cardiac side effects. Stimulants increased heart rate and blood pressure, certain pain medications affected heart rhythm, and the combination of uppers and downers created a pharmaceutical seesaw that his heart struggled to handle. Nick knew this, other specialists knew this, and they repeatedly told Elvis that the medication regimen necessary to keep him performing was actively damaging his heart. Elvis's response was always the same: find a way to make it work, because he wasn't stopping. August 1973 marked what should have been the end of Elvis's Vegas career. During a 2-week engagement that month, Elvis collapsed, or came close to collapsing, during 6 out of 14 shows. The incidents were becoming harder to hide, with audience members noticing his instability and entertainment reporters starting to ask questions about his health. During one particularly frightening episode on August 12, Elvis collapsed in his dressing room 30 minutes before showtime, unconscious, with what Dr. Nick believed was a small heart attack or a severe arrhythmic episode. The logical decision would have been to cancel that night's show and get Elvis to a hospital for a complete cardiac evaluation. Instead, Dr. Nick administered emergency medications, including a shot of adrenaline to get Elvis's heart beating regularly again, and Elvis went on stage 45 minutes late with a cover story about wardrobe issues. He performed for 70 minutes instead of his usual 90, cutting several high-energy numbers from the set, and barely made it through to the final curtain. Backstage footage from that night, which has rarely been seen publicly, shows Elvis being carried to his dressing room by bodyguards, barely conscious, while Dr. Nick frantically worked to stabilize him. Why would Elvis take such insane risks? Why would his doctor, who took an oath to do no harm, facilitate this self-destruction? The answer lies in understanding the psychological trap Elvis was caught in. For Elvis, performing wasn't just his job, it was his identity, his purpose, the only thing that made him feel alive and valued. When he wasn't on stage, he was isolated at Graceland, bored and depressed, surrounded by yes-men, and feeling disconnected from the world. The stage was the only place where he felt real, where the love from the audience filled the emptiness inside him. The idea of stopping, of retiring, felt like death itself to Elvis. Colonel Parker reinforced this psychology by constantly emphasizing the financial consequences of cancelled shows and the contractual obligations that would be violated if Elvis didn't perform. Parker would tell Elvis about the thousands of fans who had traveled from around the world to see him, about the hotel employees whose jobs depended on the shows going on, about the band members who had families to support. This guilt-tripping, combined with Elvis's own desperate need to perform, created a situation where Elvis would quite literally rather die on stage than admit he needed to stop. For the musicians who performed with Elvis during these years, the Vegas shows became increasingly nightmarish experiences. James Burton, Elvis's lead guitarist, later described the constant anxiety of not knowing if Elvis would make it through any given show. The band developed hand signals and visual cues to communicate during performances, warnings that Elvis was looking unstable, readiness checks for who would cover vocals if Elvis had to leave the stage, and signals to stretch instrumental sections if Elvis needed a moment to recover. Ronnie Tutt, Elvis's drummer, recalled being positioned at the back of the stage with a perfect view of Elvis's physical condition throughout each show. He could see when Elvis's legs started to shake, when his movements became uncoordinated, when the color drained from his face. Tutt kept a mental countdown during every performance, constantly calculating whether Elvis would make it through the next song. The band had a dark running joke about taking bets on which song Elvis would collapse during, but beneath the gallows, humor was genuine fear and sadness at watching someone they cared about slowly destroy himself. The backup singers faced an even more challenging situation. The Sweet Inspirations and later J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet were positioned close enough to Elvis to physically catch him if he fell. They had done it multiple times during rehearsals and sound checks, and they knew they might have to do it during live shows. Kathy Westmoreland, who sang soprano for Elvis during this period, described the experience as emotionally devastating, singing love songs with Elvis while watching him struggle to breathe, seeing the pain in his eyes, and knowing there was nothing she could do to help him. What made it even harder for the band was Elvis's insistence on maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. Between songs, when he would talk to the audience, Elvis would make jokes, tell stories, and project an image of confidence and control, even when he could barely stand. The band members recognized this as a defense mechanism, Elvis's way of denying the reality of his condition, but it also meant they couldn't openly acknowledge what was happening. They had to pretend along with him, maintaining the charade that this was just Elvis being Elvis, eccentric and unpredictable, rather than a desperately sick man who needed help. By 1974, managing Elvis's health crisis had become a full-time operation involving dozens of people. The Hilton Hotel had medical staff on standby during every performance, with a private route mapped out to get Elvis from the stage to his suite without being seen by guests. The hotel's security team was briefed on how to clear elevators and hallways if Elvis needed emergency medical attention. Even the lighting technicians were involved, instructed to keep certain spotlights away from Elvis's face during moments when he was clearly in distress, and to hit him with more dramatic lighting during instrumental breaks when he could rest. Colonel Parker's role in the cover-up was both protective and exploitative. On one hand, Parker genuinely didn't want the public to know how sick Elvis was because it would damage the Elvis brand and reduce earning potential. On the other hand, Parker seemed unwilling or unable to recognize that protecting Elvis's image might require actually protecting Elvis's health by letting him rest. Parker's financial interests were so intertwined with Elvis's performing schedule that he couldn't see any solution except pushing forward, managing the crisis rather than resolving it. The media cooperation in maintaining Elvis's image was remarkable by today's standards. Entertainment reporters who covered the Vegas shows could see that something was wrong with Elvis. His weight fluctuations, his occasional incoherence, his shortened performances, but the relationship between Las Vegas entertainment venues and the press was more collaborative in the 1970s. Negative reviews could damage a reporter's access to future shows and interviews, so there was an unspoken agreement to focus on Elvis's legend rather than his struggles. When reporters did ask about Elvis's health, they were given carefully crafted statements about fatigue, minor flu, or other benign explanations. Even Elvis's fans participated in the collective denial, though they didn't know it at the time. When Elvis would forget lyrics or seem confused on stage, fans would interpret it as Elvis being playful or spontaneous rather than recognizing these as cognitive symptoms of his medical crisis. When he gained weight and his face became puffy, fans saw it as Elvis getting older rather than as visible signs of cardiac problems and medication side effects. The Elvis mythology was so powerful that it prevented people from seeing the reality of his deterioration. There were multiple attempts to intervene and break the destructive cycle that was killing Elvis. In late 1974, several people close to Elvis, including some of his bodyguards and his stepbrother Rick Stanley, tried to organize what would now be called an intervention. They confronted Elvis about his pill use, his refusal to follow medical advice, and his determination to continue performing despite his obvious physical decline. Elvis's response was to fire several of the people involved and retreat further into his isolated world at Graceland. Priscilla Presley, though divorced from Elvis by this point, also attempted to reach him during this period. She could see what was happening and tried to convince Elvis to take a year off from performing, to focus on his health and his relationship with their daughter Lisa Marie. Priscilla even offered to help manage the financial consequences of a hiatus, suggesting that Elvis sell some of his assets, if necessary, to reduce the pressure to keep performing. Elvis thanked her for caring, but insisted he was fine, and that stopping would kill him faster than continuing. The most serious intervention attempt came from Dr. Nick himself in early 1975. After another collapse during a Vegas show, Dr. Nick told Elvis bluntly that if he continued at this pace, he would be dead within 2 years. He presented Elvis with a detailed medical report showing the progression of his cardiac condition, the damage being done by his medication regimen, and the statistical probability of sudden cardiac death if nothing changed. Dr. Nick offered to help Elvis transition out of performing, to manage the medical and pharmaceutical withdrawal carefully, and to develop a genuine treatment plan that might extend Elvis's life. Elvis's reaction to this intervention was telling. He didn't get angry or defensive. Instead, he became very quiet, almost serene, and told Dr. Nick that he appreciated the concern, but that he had already accepted his fate. Elvis said he knew he was going to die young like his mother had, and if he was going to die anyway, he wanted to die doing what he loved. This fatalistic acceptance rooted in his trauma around his mother's death and his own deep unhappiness, was perhaps the most insurmountable obstacle to helping Elvis. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. By December 1976, Elvis's last Vegas engagement had become a public spectacle of decline that was impossible to hide. Elvis was significantly overweight, often incoherent between songs, and obviously struggling to remember lyrics and choreography he had performed hundreds of times. Several shows during this engagement had to be stopped mid-performance when Elvis became too disoriented to continue. The official explanations varied: neck sound system problems, Elvis fighting the flu, artistic differences with the musical arrangements, but everyone in that showroom knew they were watching something tragic unfold. The December 12, 1976 show has been particularly well documented because an audio recording exists and because multiple journalists and reviewers were present. Elvis came on stage 40 minutes late, visibly unsteady, and struggled through the first several songs with his eyes barely open. During "You Gave Me a Mountain," Elvis forgot the lyrics completely and simply stood at the microphone humming, while the band vamped behind him. He attempted to make a joke about it, but his speech was so slurred that people in the audience couldn't understand what he was saying. The band pushed forward into "Polk Salad Annie," hoping the more familiar arrangement would help Elvis regain his focus. But halfway through the song, Elvis simply walked off stage without explanation. After a 15-minute delay, Elvis returned and attempted to continue, but it was clear he was not present mentally or physically. He performed 3 more songs in a semi-coherent state, before finally telling the audience that he wasn't feeling well and needed to cut the show short. The curtain came down after only 50 minutes, less than 2/3 of his normal set length. This time, there were no cover stories that could explain away what everyone had witnessed. The reviews the next day were sympathetic, but honest. Elvis was clearly very ill, and probably should not be performing. Colonel Parker's response to this catastrophe was to announce that Elvis would be taking a break from Vegas to focus on touring other cities instead. This was presented as Elvis wanting to bring his show to fans across America, rather than making them come to Vegas. But the reality was that the Hilton Hotel management had finally acknowledged that continuing Elvis's residency was untenable. They couldn't sell out shows when word was spreading that Elvis was too sick to perform properly, and they were concerned about the liability of having Elvis collapse or potentially die on their stage. The Vegas era was over, but the medical crisis was far from resolved. If anyone thought that leaving Vegas would improve Elvis's health, they were quickly proven wrong. The touring schedule that replaced the Vegas residency was, if anything, more physically demanding. Instead of performing in one location with the same stage setup every night, Elvis was now traveling to different cities, dealing with varied venues and technical setups, sleeping in hotels instead of his own suite, and losing the minimal medical support infrastructure that had been established in Vegas. The stage collapses didn't stop, they just started happening in cities across America. Tour managers and local venue staff were now the ones dealing with Elvis's health crises, often without any preparation or understanding of the severity of his condition. There are documented incidents of Elvis collapsing in dressing rooms in cities from Baltimore to Baton Rouge, of shows being cancelled hours before curtain time when Elvis was too sick to get out of bed, and of paramedics being called to hotel rooms in the middle of the night when Elvis's heart would go into dangerous rhythms. Each incident was handled locally, often with minimal media coverage, which actually helped maintain the cover-up since there was no central tracking of how frequently these episodes were occurring. The touring lifestyle also made it impossible for Dr. Nick to properly monitor and manage Elvis's medications. On the road, Elvis had access to multiple doctors in different cities, and he became adept at getting prescriptions from various sources and combining them in ways that Dr. Nick wouldn't have approved. The pharmaceutical chaos that had been somewhat controlled in Vegas became completely unmanageable on tour, with Elvis sometimes taking medications that dangerously interacted with each other or that exacerbated his cardiac condition. Understanding Elvis's refusal to stop performing requires understanding the deep psychological issues he was struggling with during these final years. Elvis had been famous since he was 21 years old, and his entire adult identity was built around being a performer, being needed, being worshipped by audiences. The idea of retirement wasn't just about stopping work. It felt like ego death, like becoming irrelevant and invisible. For someone as deeply insecure as Elvis, who needed constant validation and struggled with depression when he wasn't performing, stopping seemed more terrifying than dying. There was also a significant element of denial and magical thinking in Elvis's psychology. Despite all the medical evidence, despite the repeated collapses and the clear deterioration of his health, Elvis seemed to genuinely believe that he could somehow push through it all, that his body would somehow hold together if he just wanted it badly enough. This irrational optimism is common in people facing serious health crises. The alternative is accepting their own mortality, which is psychologically unbearable. Elvis would promise doctors and family members that he would take better care of himself starting next week, next month, after this tour, creating a perpetual cycle of postponed recovery that never arrived. Perhaps most tragically, Elvis had internalized the myth of the king of rock and roll so completely that he couldn't separate his identity from his public persona. The real Elvis, the vulnerable and frightened man who missed his mother and felt lonely despite being constantly surrounded by people, didn't seem real to him. Only the stage persona felt real. Only the applause and the adulation made him feel alive and valuable. Choosing to rest and recover would have meant confronting the emptiness of his real life, and that was more than Elvis could face. When Elvis died at Graceland on August 16, 1977, the official cause was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that caused his heart to stop. The autopsy revealed what everyone who had been around Elvis in his final years already knew. His heart was significantly enlarged, his cardiovascular system was severely compromised, and his body showed signs of chronic strain and medication toxicity. In many ways, Elvis had been dying on stage for years before his heart finally gave out in the bathroom at Graceland. The final months of Elvis's life showed a man who had completely given up on recovery. He was performing sporadically, cancelling as many shows as he completed, and spending most of his time isolated in his bedroom at Graceland. The stage collapses had become so frequent that they barely registered as unusual anymore. His last performance on June 26, 1977 in Indianapolis was a sad echo of his former glory. Elvis, overweight and barely mobile, forgetting lyrics, speaking incoherently between songs but still somehow connecting with an audience that loved him despite his obvious deterioration. In the end, the Vegas stage collapses weren't just medical crises, they were visible symbols of a man trapped by his own fame, unable to stop performing even as it killed him. The crowds who came to see Elvis in those final years witnessed something more than a concert. They saw the slow-motion tragedy of a legend who couldn't find a way to stop being legendary even for his own survival. The real tragedy isn't just that Elvis died at 42, but that so many people saw him dying and felt powerless to stop it. The medical team, the band members, the family and friends who watched him collapse again and again on stages across America, they all knew where this was heading. But the machinery of fame and the psychology of addiction to applause was too powerful to stop. Elvis Presley didn't die on August 16, 1977. He died incrementally, in pieces, across dozens of stage collapses in Vegas and beyond, each one taking a little more of the king until there was nothing left but the crown.